Cuba shows up on maps as a long, narrow shape sitting right at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico. 90 miles to the north is Florida. To the east, Haiti. To the south, Jamaica. Anyone who spends a minute looking at that position understands why, for centuries, that island was coveted, contested, and intervened upon, not because of its size, because of where it sits. At the end of the 19th century, Cuba won the war that separated it from Spain, but independence came with strings attached. The United States had entered the conflict in its final stage, bringing troops, ships, and money, and when the time came to negotiate peace, Washington negotiated without Cuba at the table. The Platt Amendment, imposed in 1901 as a condition for the withdrawal of American forces, gave Washington the legal right to intervene in the island's internal affairs whenever it saw fit. It was not a formal colony. It was something harder to name, a republic with an incomplete sovereignty. Over the following decades, that relationship became structural and ordinary. American companies controlled a substantial share of the sugar industry, the plantations, the mills, the railroads, and the public utilities. Havana had casinos, luxury hotels, and businesses tied to organized crime with direct connections to New York and Miami. For certain sectors of the Cuban elite, that presence meant modernity. For others, it was the most visible face of a dependence that had never really been resolved. That was the world Fulgencio Batista stepped into. A career military man, he had been part of earlier coups, had gone through periods of relative openness, and in 1952 staged a coup that nullified the elections and installed him as dictator. His regime was not extraordinarily brutal by the standards of the region, but it combined systematic corruption, selective repression, alliances with organized crime, and a social inequality that concentrated wealth in very few hands, while large rural areas lived in poverty. Washington tolerated him. Batista was predictable, anti-communist, and useful to American economic interests on the island. Opposition to Batista was scattered and fragmented for years. One of the most active groups was led by Fidel Castro, a young lawyer with an intense political ambition and a remarkable ability to build narratives. In July of 1953, a group under his command attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault failed. There were deaths, arrests, and trials. Castro was sentenced to 15 years. At the trial, he delivered a speech that ended with a line that would circulate for decades. "History will absolve me." He was amnestied in 1955 and left for exile in Mexico. From there, he organized the return. In Mexico, he trained alongside a small group of fighters that included his brother Raúl and an Argentine doctor named Ernesto Guevara, who had already traveled across the continent and had developed a clear political reading of the causes of Latin American poverty. In December of 1956, 82 men boarded a yacht called the Granma and crossed toward Cuba. The landing was a disaster. Batista's army was waiting. Barely 20 survived. Those who made it alive to the Sierra Maestra began a guerrilla campaign that over the next 2 years expanded steadily, gained territory, drew new fighters, and built a narrative that reached the outside world through foreign journalists who climbed into the mountains and published stories in international outlets. The guerrilla in the mountains was only one part of the opposition. In the cities there were underground networks, acts of sabotage, strikes, and student cells. Camilo Cienfuegos operated in the lowlands. The movement was broader than any single figure, though Castro's voice dominated the public story. By the end of 1958, the Batista regime collapsed with surprising speed. Government troops stopped fighting. Political allies abandoned ship. In the early hours of January 1st, 1959, Batista fled to the Dominican Republic. Rebel columns entered the major cities. Havana took to the streets. What followed was a period of genuine expectation and growing tension at the same time. The revolution promised land reform, education, health care, and sovereignty. It had real popular support. But it also made decisions that accelerated the clash with Washington. It intervened in companies, then nationalized them, including American-owned properties and businesses. The Eisenhower administration responded with economic sanctions, cut the quota for Cuban sugar imports, and began funding exile groups planning to overthrow the new government. The process radicalized partly out of ideological conviction and partly in response to external pressure. In April of 1961, Castro declared the socialist character of the revolution. That same month, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place. The CIA had spent months training a brigade of Cuban exiles with the goal of landing on the island, sparking an uprising, and toppling the government. The plan was approved under Eisenhower and carried out under Kennedy. It failed completely. The invaders were stopped, captured, and eventually exchanged for food and medicine. For the revolutionary government, the victory was an enormous political windfall. It reinforced the narrative of resistance against imperial aggression, deepened popular support, and gave Castro a legitimacy he had not quite held before the invasion. The logic of the Cold War did the rest. Cuba turned to the Soviet Union for the economic and military backing it needed to survive the American blockade. Moscow saw the island as a strategic piece on the global chessboard. In 1962, that relationship reached its most dangerous point. The Soviet Union began installing medium-range nuclear missiles on Cuban soil. The United States detected them, and for 13 days, the world came closer to nuclear war than it had at any other moment in modern history. The crisis was resolved through direct negotiation between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Cuba was not part of that negotiation. The missiles were withdrawn in exchange for an American commitment not to invade the island and for the removal of American missiles from Turkey. The smallest country in the conflict was the one with the least say in its resolution. The economic embargo that the United States imposed and steadily tightened over the years became the permanent backdrop of everyday Cuban life for decades. Soviet dependence replaced American dependence with a different logic but similar consequences in terms of real autonomy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, Cuba entered what the government called the special period, a deep economic crisis marked by shortages of food, fuel, and basic goods that affected the entire population. The system had produced real social achievements in healthcare and education. It had also built a machinery of political surveillance, systematic censorship, restrictions on freedom of movement, and an intolerance of dissent that left behind stories of prisons, pressures, and silences that fit inside no epic. The Cuban exile was one of the most lasting and complex consequences of that process. First came those who had lost property through nationalization. Then others followed, for economic, political, and personal reasons. Miami became the center of a diaspora that for decades held considerable political influence over American foreign policy toward Cuba, and that carried its own internal tensions, its fragmented memories, its grief, and its divisions. Families were cut apart by the Florida Strait for generations. Some returned for visits. Many never went back. Cuba became a symbol for many people who did not live there. A symbol of resistance for some, a warning for others. That ability to concentrate the hopes and fears of outsiders was part of its weight in Latin American history. But the symbol was always cleaner than the reality. The reality was an island where the promise of emancipation and the control of the state coexisted from the very beginning. where national sovereignty was invoked to justify both legitimate resistance against a foreign power and the silencing of Cuban voices that were asking for something different. What Cuba left behind in Latin America is not a simple lesson. It left two questions the continent never fully answered. How much does it cost to defy a power that treats everything it cannot control as an enemy? And how much does it cost to sustain a revolution when those who lead it decide that power is too important to share? Some islands weigh more than their size because they concentrate in very little land the dreams, the fears, the sacrifices, and the contradictions of an entire era. Cuba was that. And that double burden, the burden of defiance and the burden of power that will not let go, still weighs today.